There is this thing that the internet does, where one person says something that is false but sounds believable and is tangentially related to what actually happened, and then other people start to repeat it out of context, until it just becomes general belief. Because if people say things enough times, then other people will believe it. It doesn't matter if it's actually true. You can literally do that with anything that anyone says, but it isn't being done in the fair spirit of argument. It is lashing out like a toddler, usually in an attempt to make me either look crazy or cartoonish or racist. I used to hit 200 to 400,000 views per video, and now I'm hitting 50 to 100,000 most of the time. This never actually stopped happening. It is still going on to this day. It keeps happening.
Recently, the internet reeled from possibly the most ill-conceived and ill-received call-out video in recent YouTube drama history. In Praise of Shadow's video essay, Bad Conservative Horror, was a 3-hour journey into a variety of topics, like a sad horror convention he attended, the public re-entry of Kevin Spacey, YouTube algorithms, online bullying, and perhaps most bafflingly, a 35-minute screed against a variety of YouTubers much more popular than himself. But you've heard all this. You've probably seen the 50 or so response videos from drama mongers the website over. You may even have, as I did, dipped into Kiwi Farms to gauge their feelings on the matter. All that aside, I want to talk about one element conspicuously lacking in Zane's video: conservative horror. You would think in an essay entitled Bad Conservative Horror, there would be some extensive reflection on how conservative and left-wing values interact in horror space. But out of the 3 hours in the original cut, we only get a few slivers of thought on the idea. In the few moments of clarity when Zane actually remembers what the video is supposed to be about, he makes the following argument.
But horror is an intrinsically left, punk, anti-establishment, countercultural art form that is primarily concerned with social issues and pushing boundaries beyond what is deemed acceptable by traditional, more conservative, polite society. There's no other way that you can rationally look at it and still exist within reality. Just about every major work of iconic horror has had a leftist message to what it is trying to say at its heart about the human condition, and the people and the tastemakers at the forefront of the genre pushing it forward from the very beginning up to modern day have always been transgressive artists, looking to express something that they otherwise couldn't in more mainstream outlets. People of color, women, and queer people have often found a home in the genre, where they otherwise might not have in other art forms. It is not a place for hateful ideas, and it never has been. Night of the Living Dead obviously tackled issues of race. The Twilight Zone did the same. You could say similar things about basically every big work of horror fiction. Like, this is just basic stuff. Horror 101. All the big names in the modern era of horror film, Romero, Craven, Carpenter, Hooper, Flanagan, Cronenberg, Lynch, Waters, De Palma, Barker, Eggers, Gordon, Del Toro, Dante, and Peele, among many, many, many others, are all moderately left in their thought processes when approaching story and how they're concerned with social issues within their films. Now, not all of them are communist left, but still, the argument stands that they're all pretty left to be making mainstream successful movies within America. Trust me when I say that conservatives are perfectly capable, just like anyone else, of being funny and learning how to produce art. Those things are skills that anyone can do. To think otherwise would be hopeful at best, but in practice is dangerous, and allows the slow infiltration of conservative beliefs into places that they should not be allowed. Horror is a mirror. It is countercultural. It is punk. It is that way, and it always has been. But if we are using punk as an example, then to further that example as a subculture, they have always had to deal with Nazi punks trying to infiltrate their spaces and co-opt their style and language to try and distill a message of hate through their mouthpiece that it was not designed for. As a community, they have worked for decades to build a set of tools and understanding to deal with those issues internally. And I'm here today to argue that we should be doing the same thing within our horror spaces.
Why? Why is Zane so incensed at the possibility of conservatives existing in horror discourse spaces? Why does he think a whiff of right-wing tendencies justifies cutting someone out of the community? Are conservatism and horror so anathema to one another that excommunication is the only answer? Is horror left-wing?
. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . .
Horror films, and to a similar degree, horror video games, depend on two things: fear and spectacle. Fear is a reactionary emotion. It is primal, instinctual, automatic, adrenal, and powerful. To poke at one's fears is to prod at the lizard part of your brain, where our heartbeat hammers and time slows down and our line of sight narrows. At the core, fear causes us to eye the stranger and outsider with suspicion. We fear our bodies decaying, breaking, or dying. We fear the invader, and we fear said invader harming those close to us. The inversion of the natural order fills our minds with dread, and we regard those who seek to play God with caution. We tremble at the possibility of corruption and disintegration. Fear strikes our hearts when danger is afoot, but at its peak, fear is driven by the biggest threat of all: cosmic, ontological evil. Evil monsters, evil spirits, evil beasts, evil men, evil selves. Horror plays on these reactionary fears in the narrative tropes: the impurity of ghost or demonic possession, the pride and arrogance of humans defying the natural order, the perversion of the Faustian deal, the depravity of serial killers, the corruption of bodies and institutions, and the profanity of occultism and Satan worship. Spectacle is a libertine medium. Consider all through history how spectacle has emerged as an extreme form of entertainment: blood sports, cockfighting, bull baiting, theater, cabaret, musicals, circuses, gladiator fights, Olympics, team sports, Saturnalia, Mardi Gras, Carnival, pornography, exploitation. The common thread through all of these is their function in society: catharsis. They are pressure valves on the conservative world, a place where people are allowed to release primal urges for a few hours or days so that they can go back to their structured life. Spectacle titillates the visual and auditory senses, showing us taboo or inverted subject matter for thrill. Spectacle can be violent, sexual, wild, offensive, and bizarre. Spectacle also plays into moral grays, where the line between good and evil is blurred, and we let ourselves indulge, secondhand, in forbidden acts. Those involved in spectacle tend to be more creative, open, permissive, and countercultural. Think about actors, entertainers, musicians. All throughout history, they have a reputation for being morally questionable pushers of cultural change, yet they've always had a place in society, even when it's just at the very fringe. Neither fear nor spectacle is exclusive to horror. Spectacle, of course, has many forms, some scary and many not. And fear can be communicated in non-spectacular modes, like scary stories told around a campfire, adventure tales, stories of survival, myths and folk tales, urban legends, sermons, speeches, morality plays, and even signage. It is the marriage of fear and spectacle that really sets the horror genre apart. When mapping the psychology of left and right wing, I can already anticipate people decrying the political binary as useless or outdated. Very well, that is a topic well beyond the confines of what I hope to illustrate here. Instead, keep it simple and keep it moving. Psychology has long been fascinated with the difference between the psychological perspectives, between the conservative and leftist. The way this research gets talked about is often inappropriately moralized, but let's review the broader conclusions made by studies, including the modern moral foundations research done by Jonathan Haidt. The conservative psychology focuses primarily on internal cohesion and external threat. Conservatives have a lower disgust threshold. Literally, bad smells and morbid images trigger them more. They prefer orderly hierarchies and traditional institutions that keep life stable. They want their family and in-group to be safe from hostile outsiders. We call this a strong in-group preference. And if you ever tell them we need to throw off the old ways to make way for progress, they're going to give you pushback and skepticism. Their highest values are their trust in historic authority, think the church rather than the FDA, in-group loyalty, purity from infection and contagion, and conscientiousness, which is another term for orderliness and rule following. The conservative nightmare is a world of dissolved boundaries, dismantled hierarchies, lost tradition, social strife, invasion and usurpation, and the destruction of the natural order. This ever-present fear stance leads to resistance to change. Contrast this with progressive psychology. The progressive has a strong stomach by virtue of their acceptance of wide cultural differences and low threat sensitivity. They are open to new experiences and distrusting of rules and traditions. They favor change over stability, would rather push boundaries than keep them where they are, and feel that movement is the key to prosperity. For this reason, the progressive nightmare is stagnation and oppression. A world with rigid rules and no room for fringe elements terrifies them. Progressives care about reducing harm, increasing fairness, and being open to anything. You can probably already see how these profiles match on a fear and spectacle range, but it becomes most obvious when we consider how the horror genre would affect those at the very extreme ends of the political spectrum. The extreme conservative cannot bear spectacle. Spectacle is raw, graphic, unseemly, and morally suspect. The fear isn't really the issue. It's not that horror is too scary for conservatives, but that it's too carnal. The extreme conservative is going to be too sensitive to endure such sights and sounds, and too clear in their own moral convictions about right and wrong. Saint Telemachus is said to have leaped between two gladiators to stop them from killing each other, and ever since we have seen the conservative spirit of stop in the name of Christ live out in media discourse. Fear of impurity leads conservatives to suspect the enjoyment of spectacle as a corrupting agent. The extreme leftist, on the other hand, cannot abide fear. To the progressive, fear of the outsider is a moral failing, a chance to reflect on one's bigotry. Fear is seen as antithetical to progress and reason, and so often, upon encountering fear, an extreme leftist will retreat to their own emotional profile. Indignation, sorrow, guilt, and resentment. To see injustice makes them morally indignant. To see the oppressed makes them sad. To experience their survival instincts triggers guilt. To see the oppressor makes them flush with bitterness. Spectacle doesn't bother the leftist, because their disgust instincts are dull. They are, in fact, quite used to witnessing vile, putrid, and crass displays, all covered with the belief in accepting differences. They wrinkle their nose at systemic injustices, not dangling intestines. Using this model, then, we can see that the horror genre does not play well to political extremes. Both sides have an angle in which they can critically moralize the genre, dismissing it as crass, corrupting, exploitative, bigoted, or lowbrow. So no matter how left-wing the producers are, horror as a genre will always appeal best to the normie. The normie conservative isn't worried about seeing boobs or a head getting lopped off. He accepts the spectacle as unserious, without needing heavy moral condemnation. He enjoys the spectacle as he accepts his own broken and primitive nature. But he especially enjoys the thrill of watching something that taps into the lizard brain, telling him that there are dangers in the woods that he needs to be wary of, and the best way to deal with it is a shotgun to the face while protecting a damsel in distress. Endure the spectacle, feel the rush of fear that is fine-tuned for the conservative mindset, and you've got a happy horror consumer. In the same way, the normie centrist or left-winger accepts his own fear nature. He does not fret guiltily about what bigotry is being exploited in the midst of the fun. He spectates, not bothered so much by the carnal spectacle, and enjoying the feeling of us versus them, in the same vein as friendly competition. I think of the normie horror consumer as the idyllic state. They have integrated their shadows. They understand their inner dark impulses and understand that horror is just another Mardi Gras, a mode of catharsis that they shouldn't spend too much time hand-wringing over. Maybe, to understand horror, we have to disregard who it appeals to, and instead embark on Zane's project to analyze and understand its deeper meaning. A literary work has meaning in its creation, of course. But where Zane falls short is that meaning comes also from performance. Meaning is in form and function. Zane would argue horror is form-wise left-wing because of its countercultural creators and punk roots, and that its function is left-wing because it pushes for social change. However, there's a greater sociological context here. Why do kings allow jesters? Why did the Roman emperors put on expensive Colosseum shows for the public? Because in the conservative world, these sanctioned displays of excess and inversion are actually reifications of traditional hierarchy and order. We let people go wild in safe domains so that they don't start a revolution in the public street. Though progressive in their personal politics and artistic expression, horror creators unwittingly reinforce conservative emotions and narratives for the function of keeping the status quo exactly where it is.
Everybody who's watched me for a while knows that I love Stephen King and respect him deeply, but there's something that we do disagree on. In his article, Why We Crave Horror, he famously said, "We go to reestablish our feelings of essential normality. The horror movie is innately conservative, even reactionary." If you read the entire piece, he's essentially arguing that horror is often used to set and reinforce the standard of what is seen as normal versus abnormal.
Even injecting their own politics directly into the stories isn't enough, because the very act of consuming this spectacle is purgative. It gives the audience a feeling of acceptance and relief, not arousal to act. You cannot inspire social change on the back of catharsis. I realize this is not a welcome claim for horror creators and consumers who consider themselves progressive, but let's face it, artists of all stripes have had to survive by creating sanctioned forms of art under rigid cultures, usually in a complex dance of pushing boundaries and then having to draw back and creatively work around restrictions of cultural norms. Artists are tolerated by conservative institutions because up to a point, their work is seen as necessary distraction, an opiate for the masses. You could call artists sellouts for acquiescing to these terms, or tools for participating in a politically pacifying ritual. But a better view might be that art does not exist in a clear political binary. When Zane says horror is left-wing, he's right, but he's also woefully incomplete. It's both. It's all of it. Horror is political in as much as it reflects the human experience as a whole, not solely the progressive view of the world. His claim is therefore myopic. When Zane says horror's left-wing bent is clear from its progressive creator's design, he isn't wrong. The producers and writers and directors of horror are overwhelmingly left-wing. But let's nitpick on a few crucial points. All art is dominated by left-wing people, so the fact that horror is so doesn't set it apart from any other genre or art form. That the creators of horror are left-wing does not tell us about the intended audience or actual audience. The genre is not composed just of creators, but also consumers. Horror films being easily interpreted in a leftist lens does not mean conservative interpretations are automatically lesser. Sufficiently sophisticated stories can easily have multiple valid interpretations, especially when they draw from many facets of human nature and experience. The intended message is not always the most coherent interpretation. Artists can fail to convey their message, or accidentally create a piece that communicates a message contrary to their intent. Artists can lie or post hoc rationalize messages into their art to legitimize their status among political talking heads. Artists can create works that contain subconscious meaning which the artist may not even be privy to. You would think Zane, of all people, would understand these basic death of the author tenets, or even the idea of subjective or multi-layered meanings, but what's blinded him here isn't intellectual ignorance. It's his psychological profile that he exhibits as a person at the extreme left.
These articles in general are pretty unhinged and give you a perspective on the genre that you never see in other spaces. Because they're wrong. Horror is intrinsically designed to question authority and critique power, and does not work to channel cruelty. The very act of creating horror fiction has for decades been an act of protest and critique. I love art, and I particularly love how many different people can watch the same thing and come away with conflicting feelings and inspiration and ideas about certain works. That's what, makes all of this fun. But these are clearly so far off the mark they aren't even in the same ballpark or playing the same sport as the rest of us.
To illustrate this, let's begin with his infamous description of The Hills Have Eyes.
My basic argument was that the Hill people in The Hills Have Eyes are a stand-in for any type of person who has been marginalized by the American imperial machine. Native Americans, any non-white people really, queer people, poor people, anyone who would stand in opposition to the family, whose father is a police officer, whose background is upper middle class, who are openly racist, demanding, and hostile, who also have a German Shepherd as their chosen pet. They are a family made up of racist red flags, and I discussed how the movie is about a conflict when those ideologies come into contact. When a group who has had everything taken away from them, and another who reaps the benefit of the taking, are suddenly placed on the same level and are told to duke it out for survival. About how at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, we are all capable of great violence against one another.
His interpretation of The Hills Have Eyes isn't that wrong. Tactlessly presented, perhaps, but the film could well be interpreted as making a statement about how affliction can transform normal people into monsters. It could be we are to feel some measure of pity at how horribly transfigured these humans have become, even though their condition is self-perpetuated. Yet Zane saw that truth and couldn't square it up correctly. Like a good modern Marxist, he ran immediately to race and class, when he would have better universalized this as a human truth. And I have to imagine the implicit conclusion one reaches while watching the film, that we are to condemn these cannibals for how they've embraced a parasitic lifestyle, that these corrupted figures cannot be redeemed, that we are legitimate in our repulsion of them, that we are justified in using violent force in defending ourselves from them, made him so profoundly uncomfortable that he had to find a way to dig out from under these innately reactionary emotions. He's disgusted by the cannibals, but he feels guilt at experiencing this disgust, so he has to find a way to make them the victims, even when the victimhood narrative makes no sense. His ideology has so poisoned his perspective that he's let himself revolt against the natural feelings inside of him. Zane cannot bear to be human. He must be a good progressive. Zane's neuroticism can be found elsewhere. In his follow-up social media posts, after the fallout from his conservative horror video, Zane attempted to backtrack some of his choices and make very meager apologies due to some of the more questionable and inflammatory claims he made in the call-out portion. But what's interesting is the emotions he brings up. He cited anger as a motivating factor in his Wendigoon hit piece, sadness at his own dwindling YouTube career, jealousy and resentment against those creators who are flourishing, guilt, indignation, sadness, bitterness. No wonder he saw the cannibals as victims. He identifies with every inch of their twisted, incestuous rage, instead of enjoying his time analyzing horror. Like the cannibals, he is stuck in a desolate place, stewing in his own resentment, doomed to defend his homeland by launching himself at innocents who stumble into the wrong place. What's truly perverse about all this is he can't see how this horrid disposition comes off. He edits his own videos as far as I can tell, but somehow he assembles these visual contrasts without realizing how deeply betraying they are. Here he is, lonely, slouched, pitiful, grousing, bitter, and all his targets? Confident, warm, sociable, cheerful, embracing their family and loved ones. No one rational watches The Hills Have Eyes and comes away feeling the cannibals acted justly, and no one came away from Zane's video feeling that his call-outs were necessary. At one point he complains that in the horror community, centrists side with conservatives. I'm not surprised. I imagine the conservatives aren't mopey, self-important scolds who lash out at others in moments of weakness. Maybe instead of being frightened by the presence of conservatives in his community, Zane should take that as a point of self-reflection. What is it about horror that draws in conservatives and himself alike? What does he share with these people, even if he's loath to admit it? Or even more frighteningly, what do they have that he is so desperately jealous of? Zane's got a lot of pushback, a lot of it warranted, but really he should be pitied. He's not ignorant or unstudied or unintellectual. He's consumed. He's trapped in a spiral that his ideology cannot pry him out from. He spent his YouTube career pushing the virtue of boundary breaking and revolution, but because he can't view his media of interest in any novel way outside of his own tight prescriptions, he's in his own kind of hell. Stagnation. Maybe Zane will come back after his hiatus, fresh and ready to move on, but I'm afraid until he owns up to his own shadows, they're going to haunt him, and his content will be the same, his audience will dwindle, and his channel will fossilize.